Hello, Nick.
Hey, Bill.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So we're here to talk about your work here at MIT, where we're colleagues, and particularly beginning at least the conversation with your work on machine behavior, this emerging field that you and your colleagues at the Scalable Cooperation Group have been pioneering. And you guys have co-authored a paper will be coming out soon that really lays out the concept and frames it for the world and sort of will be a launch of this new exciting idea.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, so that's great. I would like to hear a little bit about, sort of step back from that and hear a little bit about how you come from a background in political science and data science, and how you came to this world in which you're now studying AI in society, and sort of trying to come up with solutions to some of these problems we're facing that feel like we're in a crisis now and nobody has it figured out. And it seems like you're onto an interesting idea that's drawing a lot of attention from computer scientists, from social scientists, from behavioral scientists who are kind of on board for the idea.
Yeah. So I have kind of an interesting path in terms of my research. I was an economist as an undergrad and did econ research for a while, and then did a PhD in political science. And then I did a lot of research in climate change and sort of the social impacts of climate change. And the reason why I got interested in that is because we're in a bit of a crisis there too on the environmental front. And there is not a ton of work being done, or wasn't at the time a ton of work being done on trying to figure out how climate change is going to impact society, and then what we can do about those things and how we can adapt to those impacts and potentially mitigate them. And I did a good amount of work on that front, and very fortunately was able to work with people at the MIT Media Lab, including Iyad and Manuel, and started to realize that another area of great societal change is coming and is happening right now thanks to AI technologies. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that a lot of the same type of thinking that I used to analyze the way that climate change might influence society applies to understanding the way that AI might influence society and what we can do about it. And so I'm transitioning to basically include a large amount of work in AI and society-related issues and on machine behavior in order to branch out into that field and hopefully continue to work on things that are important to society.
It's an interesting parallel. The climate change, I mean, they're both about, really at bottom, climate change and machine behavior are both about technology having unforeseen deleterious effects on the world. But in the first case, in climate change, it's the technology affecting the world around us, and then after that, effects on us. Whereas with AI, it's effects that are often directly on the humans, and even interior effects that can be very serious.
Well, the AI technologies and the social media technologies that we have and the information technologies are indeed changing the world around us. They're changing our social networks, they're changing our information environments. And so really how I see it is both questions relate to what happens when you perturb a complex system as a result of some input that has expected and unexpected consequences, and how do you study those complex outcomes. So with respect to AI, it might be, hey, we're going to have a newsfeed algorithm as Facebook where we look to optimize the number of clicks for our bottom line, and that produces a whole bunch of negative consequences. And with respect to climate, we're going to burn a bunch of fossil fuels, and that's going to heat up the environment. And when you heat up the environment, everything changes along with that. So there are indeed a lot of parallels. I don't want to stretch those parallels too far, but I think at core, the reason why I'm interested in both of them is because they're, as I see it, probably the two biggest issues facing society over the next few decades.
So just to continue the comparison, with climate change, which, as you said, when you began working on it, it was still kind of an emerging question people were looking at, and now it's come a long way. And a huge part of that, obviously, is building models for these kind of what happens to the system when you perturb it, and projecting forward and so forth. So is the parallel effort underway yet on the AI side, or is it really just kind of they're so nascent that we don't even know what it is yet?
Yeah, so in the climate sciences, there's kind of the physical modeling side where they deal with numerical models, and they say if you add this amount of forcing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. If you put it into these complex numerical models, here's what you might see in terms of future climate. At the point that I got into climate change, that was all fairly well established at that point. But what wasn't yet done as much was the understanding of the effects of what temperature does and sea level rise and other physical effects on the human system, on people. And with respect to thinking about and studying AI, I think that we're still very much in the stage of trying to be able to think about understanding the system at a not necessarily numerical level, but at a, well, we need to measure these things. We need to think about the science that needs to be done in order to understand how machines behave and to quantify that. And so I think we are still at a much earlier stage in terms of the science than we were at the stage of climate science when I got into that work. So it's kind of an interesting opportunity in the sense that there's a lot still to be shaped. We've figured out a lot of ways to engineer AI, but we haven't figured out a lot of ways to study AI, especially to study the complex system of AI's interaction with society. If you introduce greenhouse gases into the environment, they heat the atmosphere and do all kinds of complex things. And we have ways scientifically to model and think about all of those complex dynamics. We're not there yet with respect to AI in society. So it's both exciting to be in on that ground floor, but also it's arguable that AI is having more influences on society right now than climate change is, because climate forcing operates with a long lag. So the science is perhaps earlier and the impacts are perhaps more readily apparent right now.
It's interesting that we're dealing with this crisis as something that feels like it came out of nowhere in AI, when in fact computer science is really quite an old field. It's been around for 75 or 80 years, and yet I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, I guess what happened is most of that time we were focused on the build out rather than trying to anticipate and fix problems that might be presented by the technology.
Yeah, computer science is a very old and well-established field, and the subfield of AI and computer science is also old and well-established and has gone through a variety of different stages, and they've built out expert systems and neural networks and everything like that. And I think you're exactly right, though, that computer science as a field is, and especially the AI subfield, it's focused on building the things and discovering how to make better artificially intelligent agents. And so that deals with those agents largely in isolation, but now they exist in a really complex system. They exist in society, in the real world. And the catching up for being able to study what happens when you introduce AI into the real world, and you and I on our phones this morning were interacting with AI, was, I think, a little bit slow. And I think right now what you have is computer scientists realizing that there's a lot of expertise in studying social systems that they need to bring in to actually understand what happens with AI and its interaction with social systems, hence why political scientists like me are involved, and Molly Roberts and David Lazar are involved as well. And that's when it's done well. I think if it's done somewhat poorly, there's a risk that you have computer scientists thinking that they can study social systems by themselves, and that would kind of be like having climate numerical modelers think that they can understand the economic impacts of climate change without consulting economists. So we're trying to do it well and trying to introduce it as an interdisciplinary field of study.
And if this is kind of a fire that we're worried about now, this crisis on the AI side, the match that lit the fire, computer science has been around for a long time, but wouldn't it have been the popularization of the internet, particularly through the World Wide Web? Suddenly all of these machines were networked, and then soon after that, you could have it in your pocket, and it was everywhere.
Yeah, so two things. One is, I wouldn't necessarily say that we have a fire yet. So one of the things that I want to be very clear about is that AI has impacts. But it's not necessarily clear yet that on net those impacts will be detrimental. They might on net be positive. I'm certainly concerned. I'm kind of a realist and a bit of a pessimist, and I'm concerned that they could end up not working out very well for society. But I think the jury is still out on that. and probably still will be out for a while. But impacts involve change, and we want to understand what that change might portend for society.
Right.
And the second point on that is, did the internet enable these technologies? And I think the answer is definitely, right? So the internet dramatically altered the information environment around the world, and these technologies largely live on the internet in some form or other and operate via our smartphones and our desktops and our laptops. Without that, there would be far fewer ways for these algorithms to be influencing and interacting with our daily lives. Our social networks occur largely online right now. Our communication occurs online. Our information that we ascertain comes from online. So yeah, without the internet, the impacts of AI are dramatically muted, most likely.
Right. I mean, they suddenly were kind of infiltrating our lives. That's a bit of a loaded word, but suddenly it was everywhere. And,
Yeah,
like
I mean,
you said,
you wrote a book on that.
Yeah, I wrote a book on that. But as you said, I woke up this morning, picked up my AI device, and there was you talking to me about getting together for this conversation. That's all still relatively new in human history, and we're wrestling with it.
Yes, and in reply to that email, I gave the Gmail auto reply, yes, sounds great.
Did you? I've never used that. Oh, interesting. I've seen that lately, and it feels like, I can't use those. I have to write my own words.
I was like, that sounds close enough to what I would say on this. So yeah, sounds great. Let's chat, Bill.
I love that. So machine behavior. So can you, these conversations are all about that. Can you, for the person who's maybe watching this as the first conversation in the series, perhaps, can you define that for us?
Yeah, so talking about studying AI, we're largely talking about AI agents. And what I mean by that is algorithms of some varying complexity. Could be a simple algorithm, could be a very complex mini-layered neural network. And the need to, for a variety of reasons, study the behavior, the output of those algorithms without necessarily knowing the engineering of those systems. And the reason why you might not know the engineering of those systems is, for example, the algorithm might be proprietary, so you might not have access to it. Or it might simply just be too complex such that the weights in the algorithm don't really tell you anything interpretable about what's actually going on. And so as a result, what you might want to do is then study what it does, how it behaves. And that's really the crux of the insight behind the study of machine behavior, because if you want to launch these algorithms out into the world and have humans and societal systems interact with them, you kind of want to know as much as possible what they're doing and what they might do. So that's as I see it, the crux of the idea behind machine behavior.
And does machine behavior envision the algorithms studying as they behave, just themselves, the algorithms, the agents?
Yeah.
Or is it in concert with people, so the people are studied at the same time as they're affected?
Both. So I think that both could fall under the realm of machine behavior. One is kind of looking more like a traditional ethology study or an animal behavioral study, where you put the algorithms by themselves and you look at the features of those algorithms and what do they do when you prod them and things like that. And then you can think about rolling that out to the next step, which would kind of be like a machine ecology, where you have many of these different algorithms interacting with one another. So how do the algorithms interact with other algorithms? And then you can think of like bringing that to the most complex plane, which is now you have machine ecologies, but they're operating in the human system as well, and maybe even in the real world, trying to ascertain what they're doing and what they're doing to the humans that are interacting with them.
Right, and so this final layer envisions people who are experts on humans and on human society being involved in the examination and evaluation of the algorithm.
Very much so, and I don't think that science can be done well without them. You really need people who have been well trained in the quantitative study of societal systems and the effects of the introduction of some causative agent in those systems, and then seeing sort of what happens. And economists and political scientists and quantitative sociologists are well trained in those kind of methods and those kind of questions, how to ask those kind of questions. Whereas if you're a computer scientist in your traditional training, you won't receive any of that kind of research training. So.
And those fields that study humans and human society have themselves been revolutionized in recent decades by computers.
They have indeed.
And so that helps sort of, it sounds to me as if that helps the transition of them sort of uniting with computer science and having a new field.
Yes, very much so. So if you want to be able to study some of these things, it helps to have access to large amount of computing power and the knowledge of how to use high throughput computing systems to be able to analyze data. So you end up needing the skills of data scientists and quantitative computer scientists to do some of that work as well. But you also have to make sure you're asking the right questions and structuring the studies in ways that make sense.
So on this same theme, you had a recent fascinating paper that showed that really surprised, I think something that surprised a lot of people, and it got a lot of attention for this reason, that climate change has had not just effects on our physical environment and all of those problems that we're seeing from that, but actually effects on psychology and the emotional well-being of people. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so basically what we found in that study was that exposure to hot temperatures, all else equal, controlling for all the different things, increases the probability that someone experiences a negative mental health problem. They have some sort of problems psychologically. And there are a variety of ways that might occur, one of which is related to something else we found, which is that when it's unusually warm during the night, especially in the summer, people don't sleep as well. And there's a large literature that links sleep problems to mental health problems. So that's one reason that we might see that. But more broadly, it's the focus of my research in this area has been on the really complex ways that our well-being, societal well-being, can be influenced by altering the physical environment in which we live. And that, as a concept, actually maps pretty clearly onto how I think about studying the ways that AI technologies might alter society as well. Because we're altering the information environment when we introduce AI technologies into our information systems. We're altering the nature of our social networks and our social network interactions. We're altering what we do, how we do it, who tells us what to do, how we make decisions. And so when you start tweaking this complex system, that's going to change other things like mental health that we care about as well. So that's kind of the way that I've melded some of the methods and techniques from my study of climate into some of the work that I'm working on now in AI.
Right. So that's fascinating. And so do you envision yourself, I mean, just to think about your future work now, do you envision yourself continuing on both tracks? Climate change and AI in society?
Yeah, I mean, probably to some degree. I've got a lot of work now on climate change and have learned a lot about it. And so I think that there is utility to continue to stay up on that literature. And I have a few ideas that I will continue to work on there. But I'm also going to be trying to pretty much equally balance that with work on AI in society, because it's fascinating to me. It's really scientifically fascinating. It's something that as I'm thinking about these questions, I go about my daily life and I'm riding the T and I'm watching people on their phones and thinking about all the implications of what does it mean to be on your phone all of the time in an environment where you're surrounded by other humans, and what is the counterfactual? What would happen in the alternate world where they didn't have those phones, and how much would it take to get people to start talking to one another, and would people talk to one another? All these kind of questions are things that when you're surrounded by something so pervasive as AI technologies, because it's in all of our information technologies now, it just keeps me thinking. I really like that.
I agree. It's a fascinating question. You said you tend toward the pessimistic side, I tend toward the optimistic side. And one thing I've noticed in my study of the past and technology is that there tends to be a period like the one we're going through now, where everything is sort of thrown up in the air and shuffled in a way. And society's thrown off, systems are thrown off, everything is different because there's been this perturbation of some kind of technology. It happened in the 19th century with the telegraph and the railroads. It's happened over and over again. It goes way back. So here we are. The telegraph and the railroads didn't bring down the Earth, although some people, or human society, although some people were warning that was happening at the time.
Certainly.
So I look back at those patterns, and my basic take on it is that we tend to figure it out, and answers emerge. And it sounds like you're on a search for some of those answers, and the machine behavior is part of that. How would it translate into not just experts and scientists, but society at large adopting ways of not reforming, but shaping this AI world that we're building so that it's safe, it's healthy, it's constructive, all the things we want it to be?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? Humans are one of the most adaptable species, if not the most adaptable species on the planet. We're really good at muddling through, if not doing well, at getting through. And so part of what I see the import of machine behavior is, as you put it, kind of smoothing that process to the extent possible. It's pretty tough, though. I think that the translation of insights from science into daily practice in individuals' lives, or for example, policies or regulations in government, there's a lag period. And one of the interesting things about prior technological change, so if you think about the introduction of the car, the internal combustion engine, that happened, and then it kind of just happened. It wasn't dramatically different 3 years after happening. And so we were able to figure out that, people die when they crash their car into things. And so eventually maybe we should do something about that. Or, well, we really could use roads because these things are different than the carts and buggies before, and we need to increase our road infrastructure because people want to use them more. And all of those changes happened relatively slowly, at least compared to the changes that we're observing in the tech environment now.
Yeah.
The AI technologies that we're using 5 years from now could be dramatically different than the current technologies that we're using. I think what it looks like to be on Facebook today is fairly different from what it looked like to be on Facebook 5 years ago. And generally, using information technologies today looks fairly different from what it looked like 5 years ago, and dramatically different from what it looked like 10 years ago. And when you wrote your book, for example. And so I think that the best way to adapt to these is to have a science that tries to be a little bit more nimble than the traditional sciences that we think about. So if you think about political science as an example that I know, oftentimes to get a paper published in the top journal in political science, you'll be looking at 3 years, 4 years from the inception of the idea to getting it published. And then if getting it published is the time that then you start talking to policymakers, maybe there's another few year lag until that actually makes it into policy, or until the public is made aware of these things. And that lag period may obviate the ability to actually regulate the thing that was the problem 5 years ago. So I'm concerned about that, and I don't know that we have any great solutions to that. I think that the real trick is going to be having perhaps even private sector firms that are engaged in a much more nimble measurement of these entities. I'm not sure exactly what that would look like, but I think that it might not be solely left to academics to be able to figure out how to study machine behavior all the time. I think we're a little bit slow in the way that we tend to do things.
Yeah, so there is that lag. You mentioned that lag that is a problem, really, for actually fixing the problems that we're addressing. So on the behavioral side, you sort of referred to people moving away from the internet and having direct interaction with each other and so forth. So I started studying that about a decade ago, when nobody was talking about it. And a bunch of people wrote books, including me, that's sort of this emerging thing that, wait a minute, we need to regulate. I used the phrase screen time in a book that came out 8 years ago. And now the phrase screen time is talking to me from my phone every day, telling me how much screen time so that seems like progress to me. But this much bigger question in terms of societal that you're talking about requires, it seems to me, another awakening. For example, if there are going to be firms that are doing examination and regulation, private sector regulation of algorithms, or if there's going to be government regulation of algorithms, there would have to be a real thrust, a popular thrust, a demand for it. The election crisis, the Facebook CEO before Congress and so forth seems like it might be an early signal that that's happening. And yet when you talk to people, educated people often, there's not a huge awareness. I've done tech presentations to congressional delegations that come through MIT, and it's amazing how these otherwise smart people, how little they know about technology.
They have a lot that they need to stay on top of.
Yeah, it's true.
So one of the things you said is very interesting to me, which is, yes, you, to your great credit, brought up the idea and talked about screen time, and now people are talking about screen time. But I think whether or not it actually has been effective at reducing or bringing around awareness around screen time and then reducing screen time or making screen time more intentional is another question. Because if you look, I believe if you look at the Gallup polling on screen time use over time, it's pretty steadily increased since you wrote your book.
Definitely.
And so we can bring concepts into the public consciousness, which I think has value and is important. But then figuring out what to do about that when it's the case that all the firms want to maximize screen time and number of clicks is a tough political economy question that I'm not sure that we've really solved very well. I think you say, yes, awareness on the part of the public and the part of regulators is really important. It's not clear to me how to necessarily bring about that awareness. Again, if I make a parallel back to my work on climate change, huge crisis. If you ask people in the US how concerned they are about climate change, and that's the only thing you ask, they say dramatically concerned about climate change, if they're Democratic. And then if you ask them, even the Democrats that are dramatically concerned about climate change, if you give them a list of 25 policy priorities and you ask them to rank them, climate change will be number 14 or 15.
Really?
And it'll be dead last among those who are Republican and don't necessarily believe in climate change. So it's not just about bringing about awareness of the concept. It's also about introducing political salience, as you say. And I'm not sure how you do that. I think that I have ideas, and I think that there are many things to try, but it's kind of hard to figure out how you bring about durable political salience enough to overcome the political power that the firms have in our system and in other systems around the world. Not only do you need to make these topics salient, not only do you need to get people concerned about screen time and the degree to which their clicks are being optimized and their information is being used, but you need to get enough people concerned for long enough that they overcome the concerted lobbying that the tech firms with very concentrated interest in these areas use to ensure that they don't get regulated on these things.
So you're talking about a sort of consciousness raising where people realize this is so important. I actually have to be in favor of acting on it in an aggressive way.
That's one way.
To counteract the negative. So some of that consciousness raising, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, has to actually happen on the side of the firms in Silicon Valley, in the executive suites of these companies, where they something in the bottom line even convinces them, oh, wait a minute, this is actually bad for us, what's happening. We actually need perhaps outside people to come in and help us examine, regulate, audit what's happening with our algorithms. Do you see that possibly happening?
I think that that's going to be still a function of general salience among the public, because the thing I think that the tech firms are terrified of is something that looks like the delete Facebook movement and a real loss in PR and public opinion, because if people stop using their platforms, they're dead. Or two, if the platforms start having a negative public perception, that's not very good for time spent on those platforms, and then also the risk of subsequent regulation. So I actually think all of this is to some degree a function of awareness and concern among the public. But again, I'm not sure how you solve that problem because the public's attention is divided by spending so much time on Facebook and Instagram
and that's keeping the profits high.
It is.
Yeah, there's a
bit of a dynamic system there.
Yeah. Have you noticed there is a generational thing happening, and you're of the age where you're part of this. There was the assumption among the baby boomers who created this revolution that young people would be completely on board for everything they did because it was new, because it was shiny object, because it was exciting, it was a new way to connect and relate and so forth and express yourself. All those wonderful Apple ads with musicians and other people using the devices. And yet what I find in my travels, speaking about these ideas, is that it's the younger people who are actually in the most activist mood about this, and will actually tell you if you press them, we didn't create this thing. We were born in the internet age, and it was built by these old people like Steve Jobs, who clearly didn't completely know what they were doing. And it's kind of not working out, and I want to change that.
Zuckerberg's somewhere around my age, right? And so I think that, and a number, I went to I went to undergraduate at Santa Clara in Silicon Valley, and a lot of the friends that I had went into tech firms before the big tech boom. So I think that my generation still bears a lot of the responsibility for at least the social media technologies that we have currently. And I think at the same time, we're also increasingly aware and perhaps at the vanguard of some of the downside risks of exactly the technologies that were produced. It's always very interesting to me to see former high-ups in tech firms kind of either they leave or they get pushed out, and then a year later they're talking about all the evils of all of the things that they created. Money can influence decisions in very powerful ways. So the crux of this, and can we, I think is a question, which is, can we orient all of these technologies towards the production of the good potential that they had and still have, while minimizing any downside risks to the individual and to society? And I really think that that's where I would like to see the field of machine behavior oriented. It's about trying to make society be what the dreamers thought it could be when they thought, oh man, the internet's going to bring everyone together, and it's going to bring down barriers, and it's going to make people know one another and say, hey, that person around the country that's very different from me in these ways is also really similar to me in these ways, and it's also going to introduce me to all of the other people in my area that have this weird little stamp collecting hobby that I have, so I can go meet up with them in the real world. Facebook now has this the
ad
real world's
campaign,
better than, but actually that's tied into something that was, I think, the dream of a lot of the people that created these technologies and hoped for what these technologies could be. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily lost yet. And I think that what I would like to see, at least, is a understanding of what is going awry, if there are things going awry, and how you could mediate those things, mediate the effects of those things somewhat by intentional oversight or by smart decisions on the part of firms that can still drive profit but also be better for society.
Or by evolution of the technology.
Yes, exactly. As well.
That's very important.
It might look fundamentally different. It might be the case that the news feed as it is structured is something that as a technology just cannot be saved for the optimization of what Facebook could be.
Right.
And so maybe that needs to change somewhat dramatically or entirely. All of those questions are still open questions as far as I'm concerned.
The question of sort of the companies and how they're thinking now. So there's a sort of phenomenon in the air now and actually happening, not just in the air, that I want to ask you what you think about it, which is these kind of PR campaigns that the companies are doing now, where they're issuing manifestos, and they're, as you referred to this ad campaign by Facebook about how the better part of the world is off Facebook. Right. And the manifestos are amazing. I mean, Microsoft had one, Google had one. They're really interesting reading. They're very serious. Yeah. They talk about effects on individuals and on society. They talk about equality and fairness. They talk about all of these really essential principles to society that they now acknowledge AI on some level could be a threat to, and that they stand on the side of the good, basically.
They're on the side of the good.
A few of these firms have brought on philosophers and even religious experts, really, to weigh in on this. So what do you make of that? I mean, does that strike you as a positive development that could actually impact the kind of work that you're doing and give it an extra push?
Well, that's a great question, Bill, and you and I have an op-ed on this topic. But the crux of that is something that makes me think a lot about what I saw in my work on climate change. So in climate change and in kind of the private sector environment on climate, some of the biggest energy producing firms like Exxon have some of the most spending on PR related to the fact that they are climate friendly and they're green and they're working on developing alternative energy technologies. And
that's one of their big budget items.
That's one of their big budget items, so at least relative to anybody else spending on this. And this is nothing new. Environmental firms have been doing, big energy firms and others who in some way interact with the environment have been doing PR related outreach and marketing on how pro-environment they are. And actually this was so pervasive that it was dubbed greenwashing, because basically these firms are trying to whitewash their campaigns to make themselves look more green.
Right.
And so when you and I were talking about this, one of the things that came to mind was, man, this looks a lot like greenwashing. Maybe we should call the risk of false advertising in AI about how positive and oriented you are to AI without actually the substance, something called machine washing.
Right. That was your phrase. Yeah, which I love. Yeah.
But I think there's a really important thing to come from naming something. And I think that this is a real risk that society faces, where there's just this reboot of the way that energy firms have made themselves seem environmentally friendly. Why can't the tech firms, Facebook, Google, Apple, say, there's this real risk from AI, but we're doing everything we can internally. Though we have no external regulation, though there's no external oversight, and though there's actually really no hard evidence that we're doing all that we can to be good on this front, we can claim it at least, and we can make some really highfalutin pronouncements about all the good things that we're doing, and we can bring in external advisors and all of these people. And as a point that Iyad made on this that was, I thought, very interesting, it's kind of like if you imagine the Wall Street firms in 1980 pulling in some some ethics advisors, and if you sat down with an ethics advisor and then saying, oh, well, they had some ethicists on staff, so that surely would have prevented all the greed that we saw from Wall Street and the sort of complex risk and contagion they got themselves into, and ultimately the bringing down of the world economy. It's kind of hard to believe that some ethicists and some highfalutin pronouncements would have prevented that. You needed hard regulation that we didn't have. And so I'm concerned about that in the tech world. Now, the jury is still out. It could be the case that these firms are regulating themselves because they see these risks and are doing a damn good job of it. But the problem is that's opaque to us. It's observationally equivalent right now that they are doing a good job or they are doing a bad job on these fronts. And if they are doing a bad job, they're just telling us they're doing a good job. And if they are doing a bad job but telling us they're doing a good job, and we have no oversight of that, then 10 years from now, we might find out that indeed they produced complex risk and contagion and all kinds of consequences for society, but we just let them go with it because we believed that since they had an ethicist or a high-fluting 10-point document that they were good on.
So that would be that dark scenario would be the equivalent.
That's the risk. That's the downside
Right.
risk.
That would be the AI equivalent of the 2008 crash with Wall Street.
It would be.
Now there is a difference, I think, between Wall Street and technologists. I mean, I've now been in this world for a while and work at this wonderful institute full of idealists.
Yes.
So I think that there is an authentic idealism that drives technology.
I do as well.
Very different from financial markets, I think. I'm sure there are people on Wall Street who are idealists too, but the whole sort of the motivation to create technology is itself a kind of idealism, I think.
Agreed.
And so you use the phrase false advertising to describe these machine washing efforts. But is there a way in which they could be completely sincere?
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're trying to fend off regulation, which would impact their bottom line. So they're kind of both. They're needing to be successful capitalists, and at the same time, they want it to go to a good place. And where is that going to take us is the question mark.
Yeah, I mean, so again, it's observationally equivalent as to their sincerity level. I too am more optimistic because I am a bit of a tech optimist myself in some ways, and I do genuinely think that the people who helped build the internet and who helped build these technologies originally thought that they could do good for society and also get really rich. And the problem is that humans across the board, we tend to do what's called motivated reasoning. We tend to have a conclusion that we want to reason to and then find a way to reason to that. And so it may well be the case that a tech firm and the leaders of a tech firm are very sincere in their own minds even, that they really want to help society out. But they also realize that they still need to make bottom line profits. They still need quarterly profits if these firms are publicly traded. And so, what is enough? What is enough in their mind to say that we're still doing on net good? That may be very different to satisfy their own criterions in their mind for what's enough. It may be very different than what is needed for society to actually end up in a good place. And that's kind of if I'm most precise, that's the thing that I'm more concerned about. I don't think that these are led by evil tech giants by any means. It's just, unless there is an external enforcement mechanism humans will always look to kind of optimize what's good for them and not necessarily what's good for society,
Right.
creating a classic problem of negative externality.
Negative externalities, right. So that would lead us to the place where there is some kind of reliable, trustworthy auditing system. You know, fundamentally, it could be grounded in this new field of machine behavior that you're talking about, that is coming in, and it could evolve into government regulation, right? I mean, couldn't that be where we're headed? Europe seems to be headed that way, right?
Yeah, they are. Now, I think that is definitely one possibility. I think there's still a lot to be ironed out in terms of what the regulation would look like coming out from that. Because again, governments aren't used to building out quick and adaptable regulations, which is part of the reason why it was so hard to regulate the finance industry in the late 2000s, was they were rolling out these new instruments and no one really knew what the complex risk of these instruments was, and there was huge complexity. And
that actually began in the 80s, and then there was a new wave.
But as you build out that complexity, and as you're using algorithmic trading, and as you're introducing all these new technologies, it's very hard to regulate that from a traditional regulatory system. So I think that there needs to be some innovations in regulation, and also some innovations in terms of external oversight. And I think that external oversight probably would look best if done from a very trusted external firm, because that firm might be able to be more nimble than government. And if you look at greenwashing again, if you look at the firms that greenwash, well, what happened when they greenwashed and people called them out on it is actually there was a little bit of a PR backlash. You're not a clean firm. Why are you saying you're a clean firm? Hey, quit greenwashing so much. If you want to do something well, you need some actual verification that you're doing it well. And so, for example, forestry firms that engage in products from lumber, they would kind of greenwash, like, oh, we're good with the forest, blah, blah, blah. And they got some backlash on that. And now we have the Forest Stewardship Council, which is this independent council that comes in and does independent regulation and oversight of these firms, and then will certify them as, oh yeah, they're doing well according to the things that we've laid out very transparently is doing well. And now a firm can use that certification to say, hey, look, actually, we have this stamp from an independently trusted body. We're doing as well as we can on this front, so buy our products.
And does that help their business? Has that been proven?
Yeah.
So we need something like that.
Ideally.
On the
I mean, there are a variety of ways that this problem can be solved. That's one possible way that they can.
So that's industry, in a sense, industry doing it itself, but industry setting up third-party organizations that are not part of the companies themselves.
Yeah, they have to be very transparent and trustworthy.
Right.
Which ends up looking a lot like a government regulatory body.
Right. And climate change, I mean, I don't know a lot about business history, but it seems to me that what you just described in the climate change space has to be one of the biggest efforts of this kind of self-regulatory impulse that we've had in history, right? I mean, there was nothing like that with, you talked about the car industry and so forth. There wasn't some kind of third-party certification. If you had this sticker on your car, it was safer or whatever. It was government coming in.
There is though, actually. So the International Institute for Highway Safety, I think, IIHS. I think I have that.
Oh, I correct myself. I didn't know about that.
But also there's government firms doing that,
right.
And there are independent firms doing it as well. And part of the reason for those independent firms is that people realized there was actually risk of what's called regulatory capture, which is the firms have a lot of money and they can influence legislators and politicians to ensure that the regulation is beneficial to them, and they don't have costly regulation.
Right.
So there's actually a downside risk of having non-independent regulatory agencies that operate through the government system, because you can get regulatory capture. So there was that with respect to cars. I do think, though, that it's probably the case that in terms of voluntarily sort of self-regulating, climate change is one of the larger things. You have firms creating, for example, internal carbon prices and saying like, oh, well, our carbon price is eventually going to happen. We need to create an internal carbon price and see what would happen on that and try to operate according to that and things like that. But
on their own, they do that voluntarily.
But again, there's not external oversight on that necessarily. So it's complex, I think, is the way to put this. The political economy of all of this is very complex. Yeah. There are multiple different ways of doing it. And government is not necessarily the solution. Private independent firms are not necessarily the solution. And I don't know exactly the only way to do it, but I have some ideas.
So hearing about these efforts by industry to do sort of self-certification and regulation takes me back to the idea of cars that we were talking about, and my erroneous point that there has been nothing analogous in cars. And there actually is something today that sort of combines the car market with this idea that industry will respond to demand when there's an awakening among the public and they want products that are different. I'm thinking of those cars that are sold now with like the little green leaf on the back.
Yeah.
Now it's not a certification by some outside investigator or whatever that's saying these people are good. It's a marketing tool, but it works. People want to have a car that's certified as being hybrid or electric or something good for the environment, and they're responding to that.
Yeah.
So that's that points, I think, to the possibility that could we have, and I wonder what you think of this, could we have AI devices in the future that have a similar, some kind of like a human face or something that says this is good for people, good for society. If you buy this, you're sort of part of that.
By using this, it will not just turn you into a dopamine pump.
Right.
It will actually attempt to, over time, maximize your long-term social well-being,
right.
And your interpersonal relationships and things like that. Right? You could think of us wanting to use things, and I would like to use things that say, you know what? If you use this algorithm as opposed to this other algorithm over the course of 5 years, you're going to have more and better friendships, and you're going to do more and interesting things, and you're going to learn more and interesting and diverse things that make you a more well-balanced person. That'd be a fantastic world. And I think that was the world that a lot of the tech optimists want to have and wanted to have.
Yeah.
And I think we may risk not ending up there unless we're more strategic and very explicit about needing to end up in that place.
Right, but all the conversation that's happening now, I mean, you pick up any media outlet on your phone and look at it these days, and there is some article every day about the question about technology and about AI and so forth. And yes, it's not down on the street where people are making consumer decisions and reorienting their lives completely around this, but it feels like the first steps of something quite positive.
Media attention matters. I think that's very true. Climate change, in the salience of climate change, in my opinion at least, has suffered as a result of not receiving the amount of media attention you would think such a potentially cataclysmic outcome has. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's about attention. It's about attention for the tech firms, and it's about attention for the issues. And so the more attention that is paid to issues that have the potential to impact society, both hugely positively and hugely negatively, I think that can't be a bad thing for people to think about.
I mean, what's unfortunate is how extreme the negative effects have to be to really get people's attention. Like, I mean, think about it. Russia hacked our presidential election. That was the wake-up call. Think of how huge that is.
Sure.
It's sort of equivalent to, the polar ice caps are actually melting. Maybe I should pay attention to that. I mean, it's unfortunate that people can't, that there's such a high bar for awareness being raised.
It's a fundamental feature of the human psyche, I think, that things that happen slowly over time, that change things slowly, a little bit at a time, are stuff that we just have a really hard time getting excited about. People aren't excited about climate change. Why? Because it's just a little bit. It's just a hurricane here. It's an extra little wildfire here. It's a hot heat wave that's a little bit warmer than otherwise would have been here. And similar to tech change, right? Like the changes that Facebook has undergone or Twitter has undergone from 5 years ago to today, all of those changes, if you look at them in the snapshot, both of them, you're like, well, that's fairly different in terms of a platform. But all of those changes are introduced incrementally.
Yeah.
And humans have a hard time wrapping their minds around, scientists as well as everybody else have a hard time wrapping their mind around really long-term changes that result from small accumulations of dynamic changes that happen little by little over time. And really, at the end of the day, there's possibly a cataclysmic outcome or a super, super impactful outcome, but it happens just a little bit at a time. And we're really bad. We're really bad at dealing with that.
Yeah, I mean, we have this genius in us, and we're brilliant in many ways as a species, and yet we're also plodding. And sort of it's these baby steps that we take, and it's very frustrating because we're also self-aware, and so we can see ourselves doing that.
we evolved in environments that did not so rapidly change, at least in our social structures and in the things that we did day to day. But also, one of the things that it's a feature and a benefit of our nature, which is we're really, really adaptable. And so small changes, hey, we can deal with that. And in effect, we do deal with that. Throughout all of history, you get the ability to deal with small changes and even massive changes in human societies, and end up where if you were to poll people cross-sectionally, as a panel throughout time, longitudinally, you might not see actually that much change in like baseline human happiness because of our ability to adapt to our situation and our expectations, which means that it's really hard to get people excited about something that's going to happen potentially really negatively 10 years from now or 20 years from now or 100 years from now.
Because they're dealing with the everyday, and that can be a burden itself.
Yes, it's a huge burden.
Yeah. So thank you for doing this, Nick. Machine behavior feels like it's this total frontier in front of us that people like our group and others could define. And I think we need more conversations like this, but you have added so much to it. So thanks for your insights.
Well, thanks for your insights too, Bill, and thanks for having me.